Well, great. Well, thanks so much for having me today. I'm thrilled to have an opportunity to talk about my book, Turnaround, which came out on Tuesday. And one reason why I wrote the book and a little bit of background on me is that I love solving complex problems. And that's the theme through everything that I've done, which is solving complexity and using the manufacturing processes I learned at Intel Corporation, but incorporating those with the art of diplomacy that I learned in the Reagan White House and also the State Department.
Awesome, Lisa. Thank you. It's so nice to talk with you and to actually put the voice and the face behind what I've read and everything about you. You've got quite an intriguing background. You talked about turnaround. So rather than starting with the Reagan administration, which I just said I was going to do before we started recording, turnaround for me right now, I'm a family business consultant. I work with family businesses mostly throughout Southern California, but really all over the country. And now with COVID and Zoom, the opportunity to serve family businesses around the world. I'd say turnaround is a topic that couldn't be hotter than it is today because so many companies have just been, hemorrhaging because of all of this. What, when you think about turnaround right now, not just the book, but the process, with some of these family businesses or companies in general that have really been suffering in the last 18 months, what just, it's an open kind of essay question, if you will,
Yeah.
but what comes to mind for you when you think about what those companies could focus on now as things start to shift?
Well, I think any business is going through the same process right now, is that you have to come back to why does this business exist? What was our core competency? What was the reason we started it? And I think what occurs during, good economic times is we have more financial flexibility to follow different passion projects,
Sure.
or perhaps we add something to our business, or we've taken on a different partnership. And the reality, what you want the organization to look like. I tell people that if you could wave your magic wand, what do you visualize? What do you want it to look like? Okay, so you want it to look like this. Now, what we need to do is go and audit everything that we're doing and line that audited material up against our perfect world vision. And what that does is it enables us to go through a process of understanding where we may have veered off course, where we may have taken in expenses, what's costing us more. Sometimes cost is financial, but also cost can be the amount of time it takes us to do something. And so, is there a certain activity that we've gotten involved with that on a baseline level, it doesn't look too expensive, but when we analyze all that is required for us to achieve that particular deliverable, there's cost in that. And right now, as you're managing complexity, you got to get things off your plate. I did a discussion this morning with a group, a book club in Helsinki, Finland, of all places.
Nice.
And they asked me, well, how does this pertain to our personal lives? And what I pointed out is, even on a personal basis, we have to make decisions. My husband got very ill. He was diagnosed with a malignant tumor. At the point I had just adopted our daughter, we had adopted her, and she was only 10 months old.
Wow.
And he was starting a company, and the VC money was coming into his account the day he was on the operating table taking out this massive tumor. He ended up with 7 operations in 2 years. And I had my own business in Silicon Valley, and we had to make determinations of ranking and rating stuff in our lives. And that's what we have to do in COVID right now. You're going to rank and rate things. You can't do everything. You've got to decide what's your core competency, what's that thing that's going to kill you, what do you need to focus on, and then everything else needs to go away.
Yeah, that's interesting because I had that conversation with the client just the other day, and we've talked about, I hate to call it this, the blessings of COVID, because we know what the destruction and everything has been, but they were saying the same thing, that it's forced them to prioritize, and what they're hoping is that they will take this new vision or this new focus in their business and in their personal lives and really reprioritize what's most important. I think we got lost a lot in the minutia of things that getting way down in the things that were unimportant. It sounds like what you're saying. So we're really, in crisis, we tend to look at the things that are most critical, and the other things kind of fall by the wayside a little bit. So yeah, that's fascinating.
It is. And one of my partners at General Mills, so we had a relationship with General Mills and another job that I had, she would always call them the distractions. And I just thought that was so perfect because they are distractions. They're these other things that are taking up time, taking up resources, causing angst. And life shouldn't be that hard. I mean, if you're struggling too much, then perhaps what you're doing isn't the right thing for this point in time, this moment in time. And within the complexity of COVID, we are talking about a unique moment in time. There's so many variables. I mean, whether it's the supply chain, the cost of energy, geopolitical dynamics that are going on right now, that's a lot of variables. So you've got to get rid of as many of those that you can personally control.
What's been the biggest lessons that you've learned as you look back on, let's wind the clock back to March of 2020, which is kind of that tipping point when the world went crazy. What have you learned about you that you hope will go forward with you when we are looking back on this little snapshot, as you mentioned, 10 years from now, this is what I learned. This is what I still do because of what I learned. Anything come to mind?
Well, I have to laugh because my husband and I have had different homes in different locations because the two of us have traveled, telecommuted, done everything. So over 25 years of marriage, we've never been together this much. And
Yeah.
the good news is we celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary during COVID, and we really like each
We
other.
like each other. My wife and I were just saying, we just hit 28 during all this, and same thing. It's like, wow, we really are enjoying this time together, meals
We
together, and
did.
going to the grocery store together, and everything. It's pretty awesome.
Having meals, binge watching weird programs,
Yeah.
comparing notes with friends. We've never had that. We've always been performing. We've both been on stage. We've had dinners. We've had formality, and we haven't had that point of relaxation. But I think, again, since I've been through a moment in my life that required me to have such amazing focus, it's a little easier for me because I learned this trick 23 years ago, which is when anything starts to go awry, I become hyper focused. And with COVID, that was something that I did. On a personal level, I exercised more. And so commute and I'd swim or I'd bike. I would do something. And so that was actually a nice attribute is I got healthier.
Awesome. Good for you. That's great. Yeah. So you didn't do the COVID-19 where everybody gained 19 pounds like they talk about, right?
Nope, I
Yeah.
didn't.
Good for you. That's great. What are you seeing in the work that you're doing? Obviously you had time to finish Turnaround in the book and you're now promoting and it's out there. What are
Yeah.
you seeing? Is there a common denominator that you're seeing maybe in some of these companies that either you've been involved with in the turnaround or turnarounds that you've seen, especially in this last year and a half?
Well,
Again,
and
going back to
currently,
that prioritizing and that hyper
yeah.
focus is probably big. Sure.
So I'm currently the CEO of one of the organizations I turned around. I was brought into FAIR, which is the world's largest NGO focused on food allergy research and education. And that was an 83% restructure. And what was interesting about it is that we did the 83% restructure. When I started, there was an endowment, but our operating budget was actually in the red. And so we had to raise $75 million. We raised $75 million in the first 18 months, in addition to the restructure that we were doing. And we were hot. We were on it, right? Like we came through hell and we're moving forward. And we were traveling nonstop. January, February, March of 2020 was awesome for us. Everything that we'd planned, all the big changes that we'd made, we thought we would be raising $100 million very quickly. And we were on path to do that. We had brought together industry. The organization had never had partnerships with industry. We brought together 7 companies on March 12th. I had met with them all at JP Morgan Healthcare Conference in February, and then we called a call. We're all going to invest in pre-competitive infrastructure. It's going to be awesome. We're taking this disease forward. And we had the meeting and they all attended. And because we had Europeans and people from other parts of the world, the meeting was from 6:30 to 8:30 at night in our offices. And then we all looked at each other and it was like, well, pack up.
Yeah.
and, and we did. I did not go back into my office, and literally the world shut down on March 13th, which also happens to be my birthday. So I will always remember that day in
There you go.
perpetuity. But we had to hit the pause button on a number of things. The good news for us is what was surprising is we had access to individuals that we'd never been able to coordinate our calendars with. And so on March 16th, I had a call from a venture capitalist who's made lots of money with children with food allergies. And we were able to do a deal with him between March 16th and May 16th. So essentially, over a very short window of time, we crafted this very large research project because everybody was at home. And
Right.
so it allowed us to actually accelerate our investment in the area of prevention because we could reach him. Another person that called me out of the blue, I get this message in my email, literally in the subject line. It said, "Hi, I'm Michael Milken. Can you talk tomorrow?"
Wow.
I've been trying to meet with him for 2.5 years.
Yep.
And so, in fact, I'm coming out to LA in 2 weeks because I'll be coming out to the Milken conference. And so there were opportunities in COVID, and our ability to execute on those meant that we got rid of stuff really, really fast. We're like, okay, we've got to get rid of this, got to get rid of that. We can't do this. We can't do that. We can't do this. Boom, these opportunities are in front of us. We've been wanting to do them. They're part of our strategic plan. And so we powered our way through and just started thinking really, really differently about how we engaged.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've had conversations that's fascinating. You're right. Before COVID, I think I had done 8 podcasts. I've done 64 more since because of the advent, not the advent, but the usage of all this technology that we have always had, but now we understand how to use it. I've had this conversation, and I think I know how you're going to answer it. Go back. It's March 1st, 2020, and there's a switch, and you can flip the switch, and everything in the world that happened, everything in the country, everything in your community, your family, your personal and professional life happens if you flip the switch, or doesn't if you don't. Keeping in mind, obviously, the sensitivity of the fact that our world has been through a lot, and a lot of people
Right.
had a lot of loss. I've been a little surprised by some of the answers I've heard. As you think back about that question, what are your thoughts? You flip the
Well,
switch or you don't?
you know, obviously I wouldn't flip the switch because the fact that I had just come out of the 18 months of the restructuring and I was ready to zoom forward.
Yeah.
And I really wish I could. But what was nice about it is that I was scheduled to travel 7 months solidly with only 1 week at home.
Wow.
And the year prior, during the turnaround and to raise all the money that we raised, I traveled 18 Sundays in a row. And I was worn out. I was tired. And to some degree, being able to reassess and redesign all of our deliverables, and we've been very successful at meeting our goals despite everything that's gone on. We've had our hiccups like everybody else has, but being able to do that without the physical toll is truly the nicest gift I've ever had. And I've been traveling my whole life.
Right.
When I did my job in Japan, I traveled to Japan 15 times in 18 months. I'm worn out. I'm
Yeah.
tired. So it
That's
was
not
nice.
going up to New York from DC. That's a whole different story there. Yeah, absolutely. I went to
Yeah,
Vietnam. We got back from Vietnam on a business trip December 1st of 2019, and that wiped me out for about a month. I can
it
only imagine
does.
what it's like to go to that side of the world that frequently.
I don't snap back as much as I used to. When plane tickets during the Reagan administration were $300 between Dulles Airport and the UK, and we were so close to everybody in the Thatcher administration. We're all so young. I was 19, 20, 21, 22, 23.
Yeah.
Of course, oh, you want to go to a party? Sure, we'll come for the weekend. We don't need sleep. Well, I need sleep now.
Yeah, exactly. We don't have the energy we had, right? We're about the same age. I think we identified that before we started out. So you talked about FAIR, the food allergy research and education. I have food allergies. I can't eat dairy, and there's other things as well. So I'm obviously, and it's relatively new for me. I just
Yeah.
probably in the last 3 to 4 years is when it's really become apparent that there's certain things that I just can't eat. What drew you to that, and what ahas have you had? I guess as you've been involved in that, it's really fascinating to me because it's personal.
Well, and we'd love to be able to help you in any way we could. So, what happened is that I started the job in 2018, but it was funny how I got there. I was running a self regulatory initiative for 16 food and beverage CEOs. We made the first commitment with Michelle Obama, which was a reduction of calories in the marketplace and reformulating the products in the marketplace. And in 2012, I get this phone call about a merger of a new organization. And boy, Lisa, you'd be fantastic leading it. And I said, well, I'm doing something else right now. I can't do it, but thanks very much. And then 14 months later, I get a phone call from a second headhunter, and they said, oh, yeah, everything didn't work out the last search. We didn't do the last search, somebody else did, but everybody's put your name in the hat. They say this is perfect for you. And I said, well, I've got a job. I'm doing something already, but here's 6 names. Go off and conquer. And what ended up happening is the chief medical officer just kind of eased into being the CEO because they didn't end up really doing the second search. And so in 2018, I get yet another phone call, and it was from a friend of mine who's a headhunter. He goes, "Yeah, there's this," and yet another headhunting firm. So when you have three different headhunting firms calling you over a
The
period
same
of time and
position.
telling you you're perfect for the job, I said it was like biblical, you know?
Yeah.
It was like,
Okay,
oh,
maybe
I'm
I should
supposed to
listen,
do
right?
this.
Yeah, the flood is actually coming. I can see the clouds forming.
Exactly. And so when I talked to the search committee, I had turned down a lot of jobs. I had flexibility to not take certain jobs, and I really wanted to find a place where I could make a difference. I wanted to find a place where I was at in my life where I could put my heart and soul into it and basically help one more group of people. And that is what motivates me. It motivates me to help solve a complex problem, to help solve it on behalf of the individuals who feel so strongly about the need for this thing to exist. And I had such a great appreciation for these families. They were families of children with food allergies. One of them, their child could only eat 15 foods. After he went through a therapy, he actually got up to 30 foods, but that's it. I mean, think about it. Think if your life revolved around only 30 foods and how challenging that was. And yet the parents had turned it into such a dynamic enterprise of all the money that they put into research, and I wanted to help them take all that investment that they'd put in and move it to the next level, because again, that's what I do. I take things to the next level. And so it's just been wonderful. It's been wonderful for a couple of reasons. One is that I've worked in high tech. I worked in the food and beverage industry. I'd worked with agricultural companies, and now I'm working with pharma and biotech. But because of where medicine has advanced, there's an integration across every single industry that I've worked with. So you have gene editing in agriculture, you have product reformulation with food and beverage, the use of AI that allows you to understand what the impact will be of that reformulation. Pharma and biotech are doing things ranging from medical foods to biologics. And so it's truly a very exciting space. I've just absolutely just wake up energized at the level of creativity and innovation that's coming into the system in ways that I can help remove barriers from moving that innovation to the consumer.
Yeah, I think a lot of people look at our resumes and think, how did you go from that to that to that? But for us who've lived it, it's so easy to see. You can see how, I went from selling into sports into education into family business, and it's like, well, it doesn't seem to make sense to others, but when I look at it, it's like, well, that taught me this and this taught me that, and that's what connected the dots. So I think that's what I hear you saying is that, so you're 19 years old, you go back, now let's wind the clock back for a second. It's the early
Okay.
80s, and you're now working or asked to join the Reagan administration at the White House. I'd be curious to hear how that came about, and just the ahas that had to come almost every day in that kind of role.
Well, when I was 19, I was recruited into something called the Student Liaison Officer role at the Department of Education. That's where I started in the Reagan administration. And my job, I was putting myself through college, and my job was to explain to students why we were privatizing student loans and why it would actually be advantageous to them to have student loans privatized. And that was my job. I went around the United States talking about privatization of student loans, and that was new during the Reagan administration. It was a key initiative of theirs. I happened to later go off to the Pentagon, where I was working under Caspar Weinberger,
Mhm.
and on what are called dual use products that have military use and civilian use, like semiconductors, supercomputers at that point in
Sure.
time. And Weinberger announced his resignation. And I get this phone call from the guy I'd shared the office with when I was 19. He goes, "Hi, this is Eric. I'm going to be leaving my job at the White House and taking this other really cool job. Do you want my job?" Well, I was young, but I wasn't stupid.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they don't go hand in hand sometimes, right? Yeah.
So yeah, I go like, "When do you want me to start?" He goes, "You can start in 3 days. Can you come over to the White House right now from the Pentagon? Your boss is leaving." Boss being he was many steps above me, but I was still a political appointee, and that meant change. He goes, "Your boss is leaving. Your job's going to change. Come over, interview, take my job." And so that's actually how I got over there. And it was a fascinating time. I served in presidential personnel, which is basically recruiting cabinet members and sub-cabinet members and political appointees into the administration. And I did 1,000 interviews during that time time period. I had the opportunity to then work with the transition team between President Reagan and President Bush, worked on the inauguration with Shirley Temple Black,
Wow.
doing protocol. And so that was my first introduction to protocol and diplomacy. And then I literally the next morning, I put my ball gown in the closet and I flew to the deserts of Arizona to start a job at Intel Corporation. And funny story, I was in Arizona, and my boss at the time, Craig Barrett, he goes, don't you want to come out and see what Arizona looks like? I'm like, oh, it's a resort town.
Yeah.
He goes, yeah, but, and this was not the resort area of Arizona, it's where the manufacturing area was, Chandler, Arizona.
Yeah.
So I wake up the next morning. I'm so excited. I get in my car to drive around and see what my neighborhood looks like because I got in around midnight, and there are tumbleweeds going by.
Yeah.
And there are strip malls. They just had the market collapse. And they'd had a total collapse in Arizona. And these strip malls had all been built and they were empty and they look like the Walking Dead. And
Yeah.
then all of a sudden these sheep are crossing the road. I'm like, oh my gosh,
I'm not in
here
DC
I am.
anymore, am I? Yeah.
Exactly. I've been working at the White House. I've been dressing up all of the time. And what in the world did I get myself into? So it was an interesting period.
Yeah, you've experienced a little bit of change there. So how did you adapt? What did it take to adapt to that eventually? How did you go from, wow, I'm total culture shock, obviously, because you're an East Coast girl and you've been there in the hustle and bustle of DC, and now you're in Tombstone, Arizona, so to speak.
There was nothing in Chandler. It's a very big city now, but there was nothing there when I was there. And my first day of work, I dressed up like I always did to go into the White House. And maybe after the first week, somebody took me aside at Intel and said, Lisa, if you want to fit in, we advise that it's okay for you to dress down. And I can't begin to tell you, as an East Coast girl who grew up with pearls, having
Right.
to get myself adjusted to putting on blue jeans to go to work. That was
Yeah.
really tough. I will tell you, after 15 years in Silicon Valley, I adjusted really, really well. I totally got
Sure.
into it after that.
Yeah.
But it was fascinating. I mean, I learned so much. And that's really the essence of the book was, as I said, I learned these manufacturing principles. And I was in a factory. That's where I was, and learning about statistical process control, learning about how you basically reduce cost and increase outputs over time, learning about quality improvement processes, learning how to take all of those ideas and then apply them to problem solving, whether it was Craig's interest in K through 12 education. He was senior vice president of manufacturing and later would become the CEO and chairman of the board of Intel. But there weren't CSR programs then. So taking those ideas and turning them into building a school on Intel property as a charter school that was part of a school district, working with the CIA and redesigning export control processes. I got to do some really cool projects, and it was a wonderful experience.
When you think back about mentors in your life, or those, I mean, obviously you're a very driven person, everything you've talked about so far, and the hyper focus that we talked about a little bit ago. Who in your life, where did that come from? Was that just something you saw in your parents and some leader, a teacher, anybody even prior to age 19? I mean, we started at 19. Well, you didn't just land at 19. Something happened prior to that gave you that drive. Can you talk about that a little bit?
So my dad built an institution from the ground up that he basically started and built into an institution of 7,500 students, a university, and so that was my life, watching someone, an entrepreneur, build out an institutional structure. And my mother was interesting in that she had done a couple of things. One is for a period of time, she took in newborns who had been taken away from their parents at birth because of abuse of other children. And she got into the process and ended up revamping the way the entire adoption process and foster care process worked in Virginia. So not only did we have 5 newborns in our household over 13 newborns over a 5-year period of time, but she also got an award, I think, from the governor for restructuring how foster care was managed. And then later, she was very involved with development and the underground churches in Eastern Europe. And so as soon as the wall fell, she she and her colleagues went to, I believe, Albania, Lithuania, Latvia. They were helping bringing in medical equipment. They were helping to arrange adoptions. They really helped with that first democracy building exercise that went on there. So I had two great role models. Obviously, my parents are the type that also like to solve problems, and so I grew up with that. And I learned, I always talk about, the book talks a lot about my dad. And actually, it was a letter from my father that I discovered. I'd had this letter, had been sitting on my desk, but he died in the summer of 2019. And one of the things in his letter that he stated, and I talk about in the book, is he talks about challenging your crisis. I was at Intel, I was going through a bad time. I'd gotten the letter many, many years ago, but I loved that letter so much. And I would bring it out whenever I had a hard time. And he would talk about how some of your biggest stumbling blocks will actually be your biggest stepping stones. And that is where I started. That's why I started coming up with the idea for a book, is after his death and rereading that letter a few times.
Can you talk about any of those stumbling blocks that come to mind that you challenged head on?
Part of it was one thing you can't tell from Zoom, and there's a picture that went viral all over the internet, is that I have always been in a male environment, and I am 5 feet tall. And when I was at the Pentagon, I weighed 95 pounds. Okay. And literally, we're during the Cold War. There weren't women at the Pentagon. There weren't that many women in the military. And so even the chairs were structured for people that were bigger than I am. And one of the things, in fact, that Craig taught me is how to speak with facts, so that when you walk into the room, yes, they will dismiss you because you look so small. And this picture going around the internet was me with a group of one-star generals and full-bird colonels. And I'm in the middle of them. I'm 28 years old. I look like I'm 12. Just like, sure. There's Lisa. But so that was always a continuous challenge. And it's one reason I like to work with women and girls, is I like to impart to them all the things that I learned, and how to be taken seriously, how to use the facts in order to craft your argument. How you don't have to be the smartest person in the room, but you have to have done your homework and make sure that when you open your mouth, that you are making a recommendation based on facts. Sure. And so throughout that process, I think I had run into that at Intel, and my dad, was like, okay, challenge your crisis, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, you can do this. And it's something that I continue to recognize is important to making me move forward.
I love that, challenge your crisis. That's a great phrase. I'm really big on a little, maybe it's the marketing person in me. Maybe it's just, I hear certain words. I grew up with, parents who inspired and drove me as well. My mom was an English major and a therapist. My dad was, retired as the VP of HR of a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing company. So certainly I watched them rise up as well and watched them challenge many crises as well. You've seen, obviously the title of the book is Turnaround, and I look back at your history from age 19 through a couple of different White Houses, Pentagon, a shift 3,000 miles away to, the desert, literally, not just figuratively. When did you start realizing that you had a knack for turnaround? Whether it was when I was
it was when I was at Intel. I was Craig's troubleshooter. And so he would go figure that out. Just go figure it out. I don't have time for it. It doesn't fit anywhere in the company. Just figure it out. And so whether it was Intel had there was a period of time where chips were being basically stolen off of docks in Hong Kong and other places. Since I had my security clearances, he sent me off to the CIA to talk to former colleagues there in defense intelligence, and to deal with issues around export controls. And one of the things that was going on is as the technology, which, it's unbelievable today when you think about what we controlled for sale to the Soviet Union, because we had supercomputers that were size of a house, right. And now it's our telephone. Yeah, exactly. But the export control process wasn't designed to keep up with innovation. And so that was really my first turnaround of documenting a different process for how to do something so that you could retain national security interest while simultaneously laying the groundwork for companies to make the sales that they need to. And so that's where I learned it. And actually my last big project at Intel was Intel had lost its first investment in a major consumer branding campaign. And back then, nobody was doing consumer branding in high tech. And for those of us who are older, Intel had invested in something called the x86. And so they would have a 386 on the billboard, a big red X through it to get people to upgrade to a new technology. And they lost the trademark after a 7-year lawsuit. So I was sent all over the world to figure out what did we do wrong. They were getting ready. They hadn't announced it yet, but they were getting ready to invest billions of dollars in the Intel Inside program, the first really big ingredient brand program in high tech. And they sent me to British Airways, Lego, Louis Vuitton, and a French a telephone company, and they said just ask them what they do. And so it was really fun. In fact, I got to go to Benetton too, and so I'm going there and meeting with these people. I'm like, well, how do you, British Airways, how did you manage your trademark? What are the processes that you use? And what I realized after I made the changes, Intel Inside was rolled out, I thought, well, heck, if Intel is having a problem moving from business to consumer because the way in which they manage things is not the way you have to manage it to protect your assets in the consumer world, maybe this is a business. And so I left my job and I talked to people and I went around and said, you're going to have this problem. I went to HP, I went to Oracle, I went to Cadence, I went to Quantum. You're going to have this problem. Well, 9 months later, nobody had the problem. And I thought I was crazy and my parents were wondering why I left this great job. And literally in February of 1994, my phone started ringing off the hook. And I went from having I had one client because I didn't leave Intel without one client in hand, which was Trident, which made GPS systems. But I only had one client. And I went from having one client to quickly hiring 20 women to work for me. And we built a multi-million-dollar operation helping Silicon Valley.
Sorry, you froze there for a second. You go back and say helping Silicon Valley, and then you froze up.
Sure, helping Silicon Valley move from business to business to business to consumer enterprises.
Awesome. So you've been doing this for a little bit. Yeah. So I work with nonprofits and for-profit organizations. I know you've done a lot of turnaround with both. Is there something similar or any dramatic differences that you see between a for-profit and a nonprofit when it comes to the turnaround?
Yeah, fundamentally, it gets into basic issues, and I'm sure you see these also, which is we have people, like I said at the beginning, people have added things on. One of the examples I talk about in my book is it doesn't matter if it's business, government, or philanthropy, and I've run turnarounds in each. You sort of walk in the door, and initially you see the beautiful architecture that built the house. But then you kind of look at it and like there was this weird porch to the side and there's this odd window. And for some reason, somebody decided a chimney fit there. And all that beautiful architecture was messed up because someone moved away from the architectural design. They moved away from the core purpose of what that house was supposed to be. And so I see that in everything. The second thing is that we look at what we call the economics of the business, right? Which is whether or not the way in which it's constructed is going to be sustainable. And I talk, maybe again, because of my manufacturing experience, I talk a lot about constants and variables. And they're constants, the things that stay the same, and then the variables. And you want to get rid of the variables. But I think the last thing I have found repeatedly is hubris, which is that people take themselves a little too seriously. And they forget about the fact that they are a temporary steward of the institution. Temporary steward. We are at an institution for a period of time. We receive a paycheck, and therefore we're the temporary steward of that institution to do its core competency and to meet the needs of its consumers, its patients, or whoever it might be as its constituency. And when you forget that and you start putting self-interest above the institution's interest, that's when things go to hell in a handbasket. And that's the situation that I've walked into many, many times.
Yeah, you don't want customers in particular, to be loyal to the person. You want them loyal to the brand and the organization, because that person could shift. And we've seen a lot of shift in our lives, but especially in the last couple of years. And it's flattering to hear someone say, oh, I'm only here because of you. Well, that's great. And that's wonderful. It makes me feel good for a minute. But it's like, well, what if I'm not here? What's going to happen to this organization? I'm curious. A lot of the work that I do is with family-owned companies. I haven't seen this in your bio or talked to you about it, so I run the risk of asking you a question, you just saying no. But have you worked with family-owned companies? Have you seen anything in family businesses that strikes you maybe differently?
I've worked a lot with family philanthropies,
Sure.
and you know that there is certain philanthropists have the philosophy that by the third generation, it's not doing what the original person set it up to do.
Right.
And so either I see that manifesting itself, that it's really become something that was not the purpose for which it was originally founded, or what I see is that the family has so subdivided all of the decision making that they're accomplishing nothing. And what I mean by that is some of them go on rotations where it's, 2022 is your year to make the biggest decision about the investment on, and 2021's my year, and each of us get this small piece. And the reality is when you break things up so much, and this was actually goes back to when I was at Intel with the K through 12 stuff. Intel, what was happening is there were no CSR programs, right? There was no foundation, none of that stuff
Sure.
existed. And what Craig saw is that in out of the goodness of their heart, site manufacturing managers were letting people off to go volunteer in a school, and then somebody'd write a check to that school, and then somebody'd write another check to this institution, K through 12. And he goes, I keep hearing about all the stuff we're doing, but what are we accomplishing? And he said, can you just go figure out how much money we just wrote checks for?
Hmm.
And can you go just figure out how much time people were taking off? And what he recognized, and the same thing I think that family philanthropies need to recognize, is that if you want to have an impact, you need to have two, three, but if depending on what size you are, objectives, maybe it's one objective that you all agree and you build a 5-year strategy and you have milestones, and you recognize that if you can make large scale investments with certain strings attached and management processes in place and criteria for selection, you can move the needle on elements that are very critical to people. And so those are the two places that I just shake my head at when I have conversations with different families.
So being very strategic, not just random, is what I'm hearing you say. Yeah, have a strategic goal. I know a lot of the ones that are most successful organizations that I work with out here in California, they're focused on Habitat for Humanity because of this, or Children's Hospital because of that, or Ronald McDonald House because of an experience. And so, yeah, that's great. If it's just random giving is great. We sponsor a little league team, or we do this, that, and the other, but it's not getting you closer to your objective, is what I'm hearing you say.
It's not, and also small dollar amounts, they don't make a difference. And I
Yeah,
and I don't mean that you're gonna have people like sending in negative notes to the
yeah,
podcast. They do
no,
make a difference. Like you want to give a small dollar amount to your local school. It does make a difference because it empowers the children, helps their education, whatever. They can get the scoreboard at the game.
yeah.
But if you want to have impact, you really need to pull all the money together into large scale investment, and you need to also clearly understand what it's going to take to create change. And I saw this with diversity, equity, and inclusion. I do a lot in access, and I've been very heavily involved in building. My team built a strategic plan for access to care. We wanted to solve the problem for the population of individuals within our patient community that didn't have access to an allergist, didn't have access to the therapies and diagnostics. And what I discovered through that is just how much money we've wasted
Yeah.
in the manner in which we've put money forward. And we really need to understand the different specific factors. Some of them aren't terribly sexy. It's a matter of understanding that it takes somebody maybe 2 bus rides and they have to get off a minimum wage job 5 times. And they've got to also pay somebody to take care of their mother and their child. Therefore, let's talk about how to solve the problem for that individual. And so I think we have good hearts, but
Yeah.
we don't always think through the deliverables required to solve the problem. And that's what I try to do in everything that I'm involved with.
So speaking of that, how do you decide how you and your husband, or where do you put your time, your talent, your treasure, and so forth? I know you've been so involved with nonprofits. We've talked about FAIR. We've talked a little bit about the Health Weight Commitment Foundation briefly. We can go there more if you'd like. But what is it that I've heard a pastor and others say, figure out what breaks your heart, and then that's where you should dedicate your time. So if that's true for you, what breaks your heart, and where do you put your time?
So I spend a lot of my time with women and girls. I was on the board of Girl Scouts of the USA. What Jim and I do is if I go onto a board, and he's been so busy with work and other health issues that he's not served on as many philanthropic boards. But when I go onto a board, that's the place. Like we're making the commitment. This is where all the Gable money is going for X period of time, and that's what I'm raising money for. I was on the board of Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and as a member of the national trustees. And I have to say, both organizations are stellar organizations, both do fantastic things for youth. I'm getting ready to retire in the spring, and I'm going to focus on leadership and character because right now, and so tying all these pieces together from the book, from writings that I've done, from work that I've done with democracy building, as well as with these two, with Boys and Girls Clubs and Girl Scouts, is I'm just very worried. I want to make sure that I can help identify. I've always focused on identifying that young person who can be the leader and assume the mantle of leadership that we need for our next crisis. And we're going to be going through crisis after crisis. This is not going to be an easy path forward. And so if there's a way that I can take everything that I've done and invest it in helping people understand that they can assume the mantle of leadership. And it doesn't matter if you are from, it doesn't matter if we saw this during COVID, it doesn't matter if you're a truck driver, a grocery store worker, you're a physician's assistant, whatever your job is, you can be a leader. And
Right.
so how do we get people to understand that we live in a democracy that will allow them to assume the mantle of leadership when that moment happens? And we saw it in 9/11. I mean, I made myself stop reading it when I was reading the transcript from Flight 93. That's the worst example because it is an example of a group of people who had no commonality. They're getting on an airplane. How many times do you get on an airplane? You don't know anything about these people. And
Right.
yet what they did. And so if there's a way to empower people, we're so depressed right now. We're so losing our focus that we have the freedom to do it ourselves. And so how do you do that? And so that's you can tell I get passionate about it because
No,
that's
that's
what I'm up
great.
against.
Yeah, that's yeah. One of my questions was going to be what drives you, and you just answered that before I asked
Yeah.
it. Yeah, it's I actually teach a sports leadership class right now at a local university here in Southern California. And the question I asked my students the other night is it easier to lead in easy times or hard times, and why? And most people will say the same thing. Well, easy times we kind of put it on cruise control and modify things here and there. I look at sports a lot because that's a big passion of mine. Every team has a different leader at different moments of the game or season and what have you. But it's in that crisis, and we're in crisis, not just in this pandemic that we're in, or hopefully, knock on wood, coming out of, but there's three types of people. There's going into crisis, in crisis, or coming out of crisis. So there's always going to be a difficult time to
Yeah.
lead. Any leaders, world leaders, or famous or not famous, living or dead, that you look at and go, wow, that's my example of leadership?
Well, I'm still a fan of Ronald Reagan. I
Yeah.
still
Yeah,
believe that I've worked for a lot of presidents, but I have to say I still think Ronald Reagan was the best one. I mean, when you think about the 70s, and unfortunately, my husband keeps reminding me that everything we're going through right now is kind of like 1977, 78.
right.
And it's going to be a long way to 1981.
Yeah, we got 81 out there
And
ahead of us. Okay, yeah.
but I mean, he ended the Cold War, and I was part of that. Not I was a little tiny little cog in the wheel at the Pentagon and then at the White House. But the changes that he made, and again, because my parents worked with the underground churches, and also I ended up doing some volunteer work with the Jewish communities who were fleeing, finally flooding into the United States after the wall collapsed, and even before the wall collapsed, people that escaped. You really do recognize how individual leadership and empowering that. I mean, we had this term captive nations, which was all the individuals in the Eastern Bloc. And part of our job in the Reagan administration was giving them the tools to eventually win the Cold War. And so I would say Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you on that. Absolutely. What would you say? You've accomplished a lot, and your background is amazing, and I'm so excited to even dig deeper and learn more about you after this conversation and to read Turnaround. If you were to look back now at your career, you talked about retirement's on the horizon. When all is said and done and you are out giving more of your time out to dedicating your time, your talent, your treasure, and those resources into those really major, major causes that light your fire, what are you most proud of that you've accomplished in your career?
The people I've helped. I'm now old enough that there are people that I have been mentoring, going back to 2004 and before. And there are people someone announced last night that I had started, and she was right. I mean, I guess in her mind, I was her mentor in 1994. So watching the success of the individuals who I was able to remove a roadblock or give them the encouragement to go on and do the great and amazing things that they have done. I'm so proud of them. I really am. And I saw a couple of them during the last few days, people I haven't seen for a long time that I met at different paths and helped. And that's what I learned from my parents. They mentored and they helped so many people. You're building an army of successful people, and that's what's going to keep the world moving forward the way it needs to. And so really mentoring.
Yeah, we're not here for ourselves, are we? We're here for the other people around us.
Yeah, and other people were here for me. I mean, you look,
Exactly.
anybody who gets my book, what you're going to see is it's got the longest list of endorsements in the first couple of pages, and then at the end, it has the longest list of acknowledgments. To the point, I called the publisher. I'm like, well, how long can this section be?
Yeah, yeah.
But part of people did it for me, and I talk about my personal team in my life. I've had this personal team that's been there for me, and they've been helping with the book getting up to the bestseller list and cheering me along the way. And you have to do that for other people.
Yeah. What if you could give two or three bits of advice to people that are listening today, family business leaders, women coming up in careers? My mom was a career counselor, mostly for women in her career out here, and in the 70s and 80s, when a lot of women were really going not so much back into but entering the workforce.
Yeah.
She gave me some great advice on that. My dad has always given me really great advice throughout my life as well. Your opportunity now to maybe speak to a couple of people out there who are where you were 25, 30 years ago, or maybe where you are today.
Yeah.
Any advice that you would offer up?
Two things. My dad's favorite quote was Winston Churchill's speech, "Never give up."
Mhm.
And he used to give a lot of sermons, and that was always his focus: is never give up, never give up, never give up. He went through a lot of challenges in his life and never stopped. And then I guess the second thing is what I was just talking about a minute ago. We live in the greatest country on earth. You can be a leader. Stop huddling in your house and being afraid of what's out there. Yeah, COVID's been difficult, but the reality is you have the capacity to make a change that will impact people in your neighborhood, your church, your school, your community, your business. There is nothing prohibiting you from being part of solving the problem. And by doing so, that's going to empower you, and it's going to make you feel more positive about life. And it's going to energize you in ways that being afraid aren't. So those are my two pieces of advice.
I love that. I love a Churchill quote that I just heard the other day too. On I can't remember where I heard it, but humorously, he said, "Never stand when you can sit, and never sit when you can lay down." I use that one a lot too. It's like, hey, I'm laying down because I can. So, not the most never ever give up profound quote from Churchill, obviously, but certainly one that I like from time to time. So retirement, on a couple more questions, then I'll let you go. Retirement on the horizon, future goals. I mean, what's that thing out there yet that Lisa Gable hasn't done that's hanging out there that you can't wait to go do?
Well, I want to write another book.
Awesome.
And so that is a goal, is to keep writing. This is the first book I've written, but I've published a lot of articles for years and blogs and other things. And so I'd like to write another book. And from a business standpoint, we had talked about it a little bit. I hope to advance on the business side. Food is medicine. There's so many exciting things happening. And so being able to do that through being part of the innovation cycle, corporate boards, helping entrepreneurs succeed in that area, that's just in addition to the other work that I want to do in leadership. And the great thing is about retirement, and also the fact that I still do a lot and I don't really stop, is just being able to pursue three different things at full scale. Lisa, is totally fine with me.
Yeah. Yeah. I talked to a woman a few years ago that was retiring where I work, and I asked her, I said, "So what are you going to do now?" And her response, even though it was, I think, meant as a joke, was so profound that I wrote a blog article about it, and I've quoted this a lot, and I'll do it again now. And her response was simply, "Not come here." And
That's
meaning, I've got all
very
these
good.
projects and things going on. All that's going to change in my life is I'm just not going to have to come here every day anymore. I love it here, but now I get to go spend more time in my passion projects and the things that drive me, and travel and vacations and so forth. You see, I would imagine that the answer to this question is yes, because I know you're going to get asked a lot if you haven't already, and I know you have, to get back out on the speaking tour, whether it's on Zoom or hopefully in person, just to talk about your book and future books. I can see you out here talking to a lot of my clients about turning their businesses around, whether it's because of the impact of COVID or poor leadership or transition. Family businesses a lot, the now generation, those leading the company versus the next generation. Not that they necessarily need a turnaround, but there's always a shift.
Yeah.
Loyalty to the previous owner, not so loyal to the next, or vice versa. Do you envision that? Do you envision those
I
18
I
months in a row
absolutely
out on the
do.
road?
Yeah, no, I want to, because I get a lot of energy from talking to people, right? I mean, I am that person that prefers to do the Q&A more so than I do giving the speech, because I
Right.
love helping people real time solve their problems and talking to them and encouraging them. And one of the things that, the end of the book, you'll see it, is called End on a High Note. So one place where I've always spent a lot of time is helping people figure out their next stage of life, that third stage of life. I've helped a lot of individuals who wanted to be ambassadors, or they wanted to go into government service, or they wanted to go onto a corporate board. So the degree to, again, be able to help people think about what they want to do next
Yeah.
is a place that, it's, I've seen the impact of when people have focused on that next stage of life and really bringing these amazing talents and sometimes a lot of money into the process and doing good with it.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we're gonna end on a high note in a moment. I mean, this whole thing has been the whole conversation. That's why I do this podcast. Right? The whole reason that I started this, your episode number 73 now, since January of 2020, is I too. I get my energy from talking to people, and now why not record these conversations and share them with the world? And it's been just probably in my career, and I've had a lot of really great things that I've been able to accomplish, and more things out there as well. I'm 57, so I still have a little bit of highway left in front of me. I hope, knock on wood. But ultimately, it's the conversations with people that inspire me and light the fire under me as well. What's the best
Yep,
way for people to reach you, find your book, talk to you about maybe
sure.
bringing you out to speak to their organizations?
Well, I've got a website, turnaroundbook.com, where you can contact my folks about speaking, and also I'm affiliated with different speakers bureaus. You
Mhm.
can find the book on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, Books a Million, any bookstore. Although if you walk into an indie bookstore and buy the book, apparently that's even better for my book numbers, because we want to both support independent bookstores and we want people
Right.
to actually buy real books in person. And then you can also follow me on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. And on Facebook and Instagram, it's Lisa Gable Author. And on LinkedIn, it's just Lisa Gable.
Awesome. I think that's how I found you.
Yeah.
I saw an article that you wrote, and I saw the topic turnaround, and that drew my attention because that's where a lot of my attention is now with clients that I work with. All right. So thank you so much. This has been fantastic. And I can't wait to hear the feedback from this interview. We will put those links in the notes on this show as well, so people can reach you directly by going to the From the Heart website, as well as on the notes from this particular episode. So as we talked about before, and you can see in my name at the bottom corner of the screen here, the last name being Hart. I really try to, in this podcast and in all the conversations, really, when I talk to clients or anybody, just one off, get to why people do what they do. So if I were to pose the question at the end of this conversation, Lisa Gable, what's in your heart?
Want me to answer the question?
Sure. Yeah, you betcha. Just, whatever comes to your heart, not your mind, but your heart. Sure.
Commitment and diligence is what defines me. I'm very committed. I'm very diligent. I care deeply, and I know that I have been given the most amazing opportunities. And if I can use the relationships that I have to make a difference, then that's my obligation.